Hello, and welcome to Chapter 9, an international perspective on juvenile justice. This chapter is going to look at juvenile justice from a broad perspective. We begin with the comment that it is a worldwide problem, which I'm sure does not come as a surprise to any of you. Your textbook makes reference to Hartgen and Ketanini's conclusion from one of their studies that young people everywhere seem to engage in similar kinds of behavior with strikingly similar demographic distributions. And that's kind of the way that we begin this process, the idea that juveniles are pretty consistent in their behavior regardless of where they might be found around the world. One of the more quantitative ways in which this has been found to be true is by studies identified as the International Self-Report Delinquency Studies, or the ISRDs. And there have been two of these thus far. This listing of bullet items are kind of a combination of findings from each of those first two international studies. They are obviously repeated in your textbook as well, but let me just highlight, as I haven't read, a few of these items. We know, first of all, that juvenile delinquency worldwide involves mostly minor offenses. There are obviously some very serious ones as well, but for the most part, when we're talking about juvenile delinquency worldwide, we're talking about minor offenses. Boys are consistently more involved in juvenile delinquency actions, especially violent and serious crimes, than are girls. This is a gender difference that we find again around the world. We also find that there is similarity in terms of the peak ages for committing certain kinds of crimes. We see here, for example, that 14 to 15-year-olds are more likely to be involved in vandalism, 16 and 17-year-olds property crimes, and then 18 to 20-year-olds the age range when we get into the violent crime areas. And again, consistent findings regardless of what country we're talking about. We also find that there's a correlation between self-reports of delinquency and peer group activities. Basically, the understanding that youths are most likely to misbehave when they are in the accompaniment of their peers. And again, this is not inconsistent with findings that we've had over the last several decades regarding research specifically in the United States, but it's being found in other countries as well. So peer group influence does have a major role to play. The last one mentioned there is that parental supervision being a powerful predictor. In all the countries studied, the less supervision, the more delinquent behavior that was found. So this is a good way, I think, to remind ourselves that when we're talking about juvenile delinquency specifically, we're talking about the kind of behavior or a kind of behavior that is fairly consistent amongst juveniles regardless of which country we find them in. So what are some of the contributing factors? Well, this is where we see a little bit of difference, but again, as we go across this, you'll see that there are some similarities as well. The factors that contribute to delinquency behavior in the United States is similar to the factors that contribute to delinquency other places in the world. Just picking a few of these, for example, Africa, the contributors most clearly are hunger, poverty, unemployment, and armed conflict. Those are things that are very not so much specific to Africa, but certainly can be identified as contributing factors to a lot of things, including juvenile delinquency. Jumping over to Latin America, again, economic problems, bringing high unemployment rates. That means there's levels of homelessness among children and adolescents, and that, again, is going to put those young people in a situation in which the likelihood of committing delinquent acts is going to be dramatically increased. In the Arab world, it varies by country. Unemployment can be a factor in those Middle Eastern countries that have economic problems. And even in the prosperous countries, there are factors such as urbanization and sudden affluence coming into a great deal of money because of the economic conditions of the country can also move one toward delinquent behavior. Industrialized countries, the increased prosperity led to increased opportunities for juvenile crime. Other factors including things like changes in the family structure, getting back to that earlier point that we had, less frequent supervision by parents, for example. Relative deprivation, so that you aren't so much deprived as in terms of maybe young people in other countries or even in your own country, but you're deprived relative to those people that you associate with, that you hang out with. You're deprived relative to the items you see in store windows that other people are buying, deprived relative to what you see on television as being what is commonly found by many people. So these are things that those of you that have had courses on juvenile delinquency are already familiar with in terms of things that might help explain or contribute to delinquent behavior in the more industrialized countries, where we don't find things like in Africa, hunger and poverty and unemployment to the same degree that we do in the industrialized countries. Well, one of the things that we oftentimes don't even think about is the question, who are the juveniles? In the United States, the definition of juvenile delinquency varies depending upon the state. There are no federal laws regarding what a juvenile, regarding how each state must define juvenile delinquency or what the age limit is. And that's true around the world as well. There simply aren't any universally agreed upon statements for the age at which someone is deemed to be criminally responsible. And in fact, although age is clearly the most frequently used, there are a few countries, Saudi Arabia being an example used here, where there is a criteria for determining criminal responsibility other than age, and it happens to be puberty in Saudi Arabia. But as I said, age is certainly the most frequently used criterion in any country in trying to determine how or at what point does someone become criminally responsible. Some jurisdictions provide no clear indicator at all as to what the minimum age might be. They just have no comment about it. Others will set the age as low as 7 years, and a few have it very high, as much as age 16, which is actually quite high for determining criminal responsibility. Not until you reach age 17, this might be. Well, as a result of this variation in terms of what constitutes juveniles or juvenile criteria, the United Nations has been very hesitant to come out with any even recommendation as to what the appropriate age will be. So instead, United Nations statement suggests something as broad, for example, as the age of criminal responsibility should be fixed not too low, bearing in mind that the facts of emotional, mental, and intellectual maturity. So they aren't saying that this is what all countries should abide by, simply that they're a very broad category. It shouldn't be too low. Well, one of the ways that we can go about comparing how juvenile justice is carried out in countries around the world is to set up a grouping of models. There are a variety of ways in which this can be done. Some books and authors have chosen to identify 6, 7 different kinds of juvenile justice models. But most of those are based around 2 very broad concepts, and that's what we're using here. Instead of distinguishing a great number of models, we're going to just go with the broad concepts, saying that juvenile justice models follow along a continuum of either the welfare model or the justice model. When we're talking about the welfare model, we're talking about those juvenile justice systems which take a more paternalistic approach. The emphasis is going to be upon the juvenile's well-being. There's going to be an attempt to divert the juvenile from formal action. That certainly is the preference under a welfare model. And the sanctions should be primarily treatment or rehabilitation-oriented rather than punitive. Under the justice end of the continuum, however, these systems are much more likely to take a protectionist approach to juvenile offenders. Juveniles are considered to be rational individuals, and they're responsible for their actions, and they need to be held responsible by the juvenile justice system. While holding the juveniles accountable, it's also important to follow certain procedures that will protect the due process rights of the juveniles. So the justice model comes a little bit closer to the adult criminal justice model, saying that we have to hold people responsible, but that we also want to make sure that they are protected in terms of due process rights. Sanctions should be proportionate to the seriousness of the offense. and they should be handed out with more concern about matching the offense to the punishment, even if that means that the sanctions aren't so treatment or welfare oriented. So those are the extremes along which we can measure these the continuum. And you see here the welfare model at the extreme continuum on the left, and the justice model at the continuum on the right. And following along those continuums are the 4 countries that are used in your textbook to give you an idea of how juvenile justice might be set up. So that we have New Zealand as a more clear model, a welfare model example, and we have England and Wales as being a more clear justice model. Falling between those, Italy tends to lean toward the welfare model. China tends to lean toward the justice model. And again, you see here that at the welfare model, we're emphasizing paternalism. There's going to be more treatment orientation. At the justice model, we're emphasizing due process rights and accountability. And there's going to be a greater interest in making sure that the punishment is proportionate to what the crime was or the perceived offense was. So taking a look at some of these more specifically, as your textbook does, the welfare model with New Zealand being the more prime example, this is going to focus on the needs rather than the deeds of the juveniles in New Zealand. Their real goal in New Zealand is to reintegrate the offender back into the community. And they do this through what are called family group conferences. And the goal of the family group conference is this reintegration. And they'll accomplish it by having the juvenile attend meetings, a family group conference. But at that meeting is going to be not just the offender, but also the victim, community members, family members of the offender, a variety of individuals who are seen as playing important roles in getting this juvenile offender to be accepted back into the community. Now, accountability is still important in New Zealand, even though we use that as a term to identify the justice model. But under the family group conferencing, it's important that the juvenile accepts responsibility for his or her actions, but it's also very important that the community help that juvenile come back into and feel part of the community. Italy is seen as leaning toward the welfare model. Basically here we have a legal requirement that there should be as much attempt to divert the juvenile from the formal process as possible. This is one of the reasons why it's leaning more toward the welfare model. There can be a variety of ways in which this is accomplished. At the pretrial level, for example, you could issue just a judicial pardon. You could impose non-custodial sanctions. If you do get to the trial, a more formal trial, then even here you have penalties that would be designed more for minors, although you could still have adult penalties as well. But in Italy, the goal is this diversion process, trying to keep the juvenile out of the system and trying to find sanctions that are more appropriate given the juvenile's status, age, and so on. So it leans, as I said, more toward the welfare model. The justice model examples include China, which is moving along the continuum more toward the justice system, the justice model. In China, there aren't any procedures that are specifically identified as being juvenile justice. The age of criminal responsibility is set rather high, actually, at age 16. But persons ages 14 to 16 who are seen as committing serious crimes are considered responsible for their actions, but they receive a lesser punishment. So it's that category prior to age 6, or actually including age 16, where the individual can be held accountable but receive less penalty. The categories that China uses for juveniles is juvenile misbehavior, serious juvenile misbehavior, and juvenile criminal law violations, with that last one being the most serious. And so within these categories, different kinds of sanctions can be imposed. This gives you an idea then that in China, we're moving more toward the justice model because there are going to be more adult punishments. There is a greater interest in matching the crime to the punishment. There is less of an emphasis on rehabilitation, welfare, and so on. But England and Wales provide the far end example of the justice model. In England and Wales, juveniles are viewed as being responsible individuals, and they need to be held accountable for their actions. And they should be given due process rights as they move toward the trial process. Sentences should be proportionate to the punishment, and in many ways there isn't a whole lot of difference between how juveniles are handled and how adults are handled. Criminal responsibility starts very early in England and Wales at age 10, but persons ages 10 to 17 are subject to special procedures and penalties, and this is one of the ways that it's distinguished from the adult system. But still, the accountability, the punishments that are available, and so on, make it seem much more of an emphasis upon these features of accountability and proportionality of punishment than you would find in the welfare model. That's a very brief overview of Chapter 9, which in itself isn't a long chapter anyway, but it gives you an idea of how juvenile justice might be accomplished in different countries around the world. Here, just a reminder then that if you would like to choose juvenile justice as one of the topics that you use for your term paper, it would be perfectly appropriate. You would simply need to identify which topic, or which of the four broad areas, law, police, courts, or corrections, your topic is attached to, so that we know which one you're doing. Examples might include describing where your three countries fall along the continuum. This would link mostly to the broad category of law. You could also compare specific programs, and so depending upon which programs you are comparing, your example might fall into police, courts, or corrections. You could look at how delinquency prevention programs might be set up, what role the police might have, or ways to control delinquency, etc. That gives you some ideas as to what might be an appropriate topic. Thank you for your attention, and I appreciate you taking a look at the PowerPoint.